whenever people talk about Alberta separatism, they always talk about equalization payments. And I don't know a whole lot about it, so here we go. Can you describe how equalization works in Canada for me? Can you go into details? Here we go. Equalization is one of the more misunderstood pieces of Canadian fiscal federalism, so it's worth building it up carefully. Given you're in Alberta, where it's a perennial score point, I'll try to be precise about the parts that get mangled in political debates. Okay. A perennial sore point. The constitutional basis and the core purpose. Equalization is entrenched in subsection 36 of the Constitution Act 1982. The commitment is to ensure that provincial governments have sufficient revenues to provide reasonably comparable levels of public services at reasonably comparable levels of taxation. That sentence is doing a lot of work. The goal isn't to make provinces equal in wealth or to equalize actual services delivered. It's to give every provincial government enough revenue raising capacity that it could offer comparable services without resorting to punishingly high taxes. A crucial consequence. The payments are unconditional. Receiving provinces can spend the money however they want. Health, roads, debt repayment, tax cuts, whatever. Ottawa doesn't attach strings, which distinguishes equalization from the Canadian health transfer and Canadian social transfer. So a lot of money that the U.S. that Ottawa gives to provinces is conditional. Like they give provinces money for like education purposes, but you have to follow certain parameters with the money you receive. The Canada Health Transfer and the Canada Social Transfer, same things. You receive the money, but it has to be allocated in specific ways. It sounds like the equalization payment is not like this, and if you receive an equalization payment, it can be spent however you want. This fiscal capacity is the whole game. The thing is, like, every time I talk about like Alberta separatism, equalization is one of the key sticking points they have, and like I personally, as someone who lives in Alberta, tend to agree with them. Like, we give a lot of money in equalization that we don't get back from the government. Like, we are definitely one of the net contributors consistently. And you know, that isn't a problem. The issue is, in my opinion, the equalization system is designed in such a way that the provinces that receive money are not incentivized to change and develop their economy in such a way that they would be able to provide money rather than receiving the money. And so you have a problem where equalization is creating an incentive to not grow. It's kind of like the welfare trap, where you give someone welfare, but if they make any of their own money, then you limit the welfare they receive, and it incentivizes people to not try to improve their own standing while they're on welfare. It's kind of like that, but on a provincial level, where if you're receiving large amounts of money in equalization, you're not incentivized to develop because you'd receive less in equalization, and it costs money to develop, and so it's kind of like it's no longer in your best interest to even try that. And that is the biggest problem with equalization that I personally see. But let's continue reading about it. Fiscal capacity is the whole game. The program turns on a single concept, fiscal capacity, meaning the revenues a province could raise if it taxed at the national average rate. The word could is the key. A province's actual tax rate and actual spending decisions are deliberately irrelevant to the calculation. This is the design feature most often miss. People most often miss. Provinces cannot lower their tax rates to get more equalization, and they can't raise the rates to get less, because the formula inputs what they'd collect at an average rate regardless of what they actually do. If Alberta abolishes provincial income tax tomorrow, its measured fiscal capacity wouldn't change at all. This prevents provinces from gaming the system by manipulating their own tax policy. Okay, well that's a good design. That's a good design choice, in my opinion. The mechanism works by comparison. Each province's per capita fiscal capacity is compared with the average fiscal capacity across all provinces. If a province is below average, it receives a payment to make up the gap. If it's above average, it gets nothing. There's no clawback from rich provinces. Being above average simply means you receive zero, not that you pay in. What? Being above average simply means you receive zero, not that you pay in. I mean, the country pays in as a whole, right? Like, taxation is where the money comes from. Fiscal capacity is assessed across roughly 5 revenue categories: personal income tax, business/corporate income tax, consumption taxes, property taxes, and natural resource revenue. Each is measured against what the national average rate would yield, given that province's tax base. Where does the money from equalization come from? Ooh, yeah, I forgot how long this one was. Got to the bottom of this. Yeah. The formula mechanics. A few moving parts make the actual calculation more stable than the raw concept suggests. The lagged moving average payments don't track current year conditions. Fiscal capacity is estimated on a wait 3 years move. Okay, so they just have a whole system designed to calculate it. The natural resource problem. Resources are the most contentious technical piece, and the rules are deliberately compromised. Following the 2006 expert panel recommendation, fiscal capacity from natural resources is assessed using partial inclusion. Only part of the actual resource revenue a province collects is counted. The standard figure is 50% inclusion. Oh, so resources are actually included at a 50% rate over. I'm guessing this is resource revenue, and so the revenue you'd make from oil, only half of it counts towards your average for equalization. It doesn't. I mean, that doesn't really matter because Alberta gets nothing, and 50%, 100%. You're always going to be above that average, so it doesn't really change anything for Alberta, but it only includes that at 50%. The logic was to avoid penalizing provinces too heavy for developing their resources, an issue that it still does, in my opinion. Full inclusion would mean a province loses nearly every dollar of equalization for every dollar of revenue, resource revenue, a strong disincentive to develop. It's even at 50%, it's a pretty strong incentive not to develop. in my opinion. There's also a cap. Provinces' equalization payment cannot raise its fiscal capacity above that of the lowest non-receiving provinces once all resource revenues are counted at 100%. So you can't have, so you have your line, you're above the line, you get nothing. You're below the line, you get equalization. That equalization cannot push you above someone who's paying equalization payments, essentially. You can't, you can go up to them, but you can't end up above them based on their fiscal capacity. This fiscal capacity cap is precisely what Newfoundland and Labrador is fighting about. More on that below. The lowest non-receiving province. Well, a province's equalization payment cannot raise its fiscal capacity above that of the lowest non-receiving province. So the lowest non-receiving province is, you have your average, it's the one that's just above the average. And so basically you can't, your province equalization payment can't push your fiscal capacity above the average. The one above the average, but basically near the average. I mean, again, that makes sense. You're given them money. You shouldn't be giving them money above the cap. Short version, it comes out of one big undifferentiated pool, the federal government's general revenues, and there is no dedicated equalization tax fund or account anywhere in this system. So it's just the government's taxation. So the government has taxes, brings in all their tax money. It looks at fiscal capacity for each of the provinces, which is, they probably have an in-depth formula for it that I skipped over up here. It basically judges how much tax revenue can be brought in by the province at average rates, and based on your province's fiscal capacity, it ranks them, and those in the lower half receive equalization payments. And so this is to provide a standardized, continuous, like approximate standard of care across the entire country. Because in places that have lower fiscal revenue, they cannot raise enough taxes to pay for standardized healthcare like other places. And so if you want your standardized healthcare system consistent across the whole countries, you have to support the places that cannot provide that healthcare themselves with their tax revenue. It makes sense. I disagree with including resources like at all. That is a disincentive to, I mean, the whole thing disincentivizes development, because if you develop, then you raise your fiscal capacity, you get less equalization. I think equalization should come with strings. Like, a certain amount of it should be forced to go towards development. Developing businesses, developing resources, developing the economy in the province. Like, some of it, obviously, education, healthcare, like these are the services you wanted to consistently to have consistency across the country. But I think if you're giving large equalization, a percentage of it should be constrained towards development. The idea is that you use the money to raise their fiscal capacity, so that they're no longer recipients of equalization. Maybe they can even provide for equalization, become net beneficiaries. But the equalization itself, I don't disagree with. I kind of disagree with the resource aspect of it, and I disagree with not putting constraints on the money. Okay, where was I? The GDP linked ceiling and floor. Since 2009, the total size of the program has been tied to economic growth rather than to the actual measured disparities. The overall envelopment is adjusted to keep the total payout growing in line with economic nominal GDP. Ooh. Okay. So, as GDP goes up, the amount of equalization goes up. I mean, tying it to that, it incentivizes immigration. That's the first thing, because we in Canada we have stagnant growth. GDP per capita has generally been going down, and the only way you get the GDP to go up is through immigration. And so if you want more equalization, you need GDP to go up, you need more immigrants. I think that's a weird thing to link it to. I don't know. I don't know if I like this part of it. Like, I think that's something that you just discuss. Equalization should be something you just discuss, and if it needs to go up, well, you need to get something passed to get it to go up, rather than just tying it to something like GDP. I still think this is a far smaller issue than making it so that there's no conditions to the money. I think you need conditions to the money. This cuts both ways, and it's genuinely odd. Okay, happy it agrees. It functions as both a ceiling and a floor. The total growth with GDP, even when fiscal disparity among provinces shrinks. Oh, I need to think about that. So, if the so I'm gonna consider have-nots are those that get equalization. The haves are those that generally pay into the equalization or just get nothing from equalization. So when the difference between the haves and the have-nots shrinks, the equalization is still large, and it doesn't account for that at all. Even though the equalization can't bring you above, it can't bring the have-not above the lowest have. But even as they shrink, that the amount they're receiving doesn't change. That's again, this is something that should be discussed and passed, I think, in Parliament yearly. Meaning the program keeps expanding even in years when provinces are converging and need less equalization in principle. When the amount that would be generated by actual disparities falls below the GDP growth figure, the difference gets distributed to recipient provinces as adjustment payments. When the amount that would be generated by actual disparities falls below the GDP growth figure, the difference gets distributed to recipient provinces as adjustment payments. Okay, this GDP floor mechanism is exactly the feature critics like Saskatchewan and the People's Party point to when they argue that the program has become a self-perpetuating entitlement detached from real need. I agree. It, like, equalization should be discussed every year, and the amount should be addressed every year, and not just this flat setup system. I fundamentally agree with equalization. I disagree with how they seem to be doing it. I've been learning about equalization in Canada and fiscal capacity. Can you tell me what the fiscal capacity was for each province and show it to me on a chart? For each province last year? There's got to be information on this. Where was I? There's a wrinkle here that explains a quirk you may have noticed. If a non-recipient, so a have province, would end up with lower per capita fiscal capacity than a recipient province after adjustment payments are made, the non-recipient becomes eligible for adjustment payments too. That's why Ontario received equalization. Oh, so equalization is a set amount, and so you have the haves, which get nothing, and the have-nots, and they all receive an equalization bump. And if one of them is bumping up, it's essentially moving the average line up. And if a have has the average line moved above, then they can also receive a payment. So a have province can receive a payment if the equalization line is bumping it up. But like, they're trying to bump all of them up to the average, right? I don't know. This goes back to like, you're incentivizing them to not develop. You're incentivizing the have-not provinces to not develop. And I don't think that's a good incentive to create. Who actually pays the Alberta misconception? Okay, we'll get into that. Did you give me a chart yet? You've not given me a chart yet. Well, we'll continue. The Alberta misconception. This is worth being very precise about because it's where Alberta political rhetoric and the technical reality diverge most. Equalization is financed entirely from the federal government's general revenue, which comes from federal taxes. Provincial governments make no contribution to the program. There is no account that Alberta's provincial government pays into. The government of Alberta does not write a check to Quebec. So the whole issue stems from oil is a very profitable industry. Oil is a very taxed industry. The federal government collects taxes. And so when they give you numbers about how much equalization costs Alberta, it's how much of that tax revenue that is collected is going to equalization, from my understanding. And because Alberta has an industry such as oil, which is highly profitable, and therefore generates very high taxes, this is why Alberta ends up as a have province so consistently. Even when resources are taxed or considered only at 50% for equalization, it's still an incredibly beneficial industry, right? And so that's where they're coming from, and this is how it actually works. So it's the oil is not being, like, Alberta oil is not being taxed any more than oil anywhere else in the country. It's just there's so much of it that's why it sways the equalization payments, from my understanding. What is true is that Albertans as individuals and corporations pay a disproportionate share of federal taxes because Alberta has historically had high incomes and a strong economy. So the same federal tax rate collect more there per person. Those federal taxes fund all federal spending, including equalization. So the honest framing is Albertans contribute more to federal general revenue than they receive back from many federal programs, and equalization is part of that broader pattern. But there's no provincial transfer and no Alberta-specific equalization levy. In strict terms, provinces make no contributions. The funding comes from the federal tax system that applies to everyone equally, regardless of province. Reasonable people disagree about whether the strict term framing or the Alberta pays more federal tax framing is the more meaningful one, and that disagreement is most of the political fight. Okay, so that explains it to me better. It's not that Alberta is taxed more than anywhere else. They pay more taxes generally because they have higher incomes. They have more profitable industries like oil that makes better incomes. And because of that, they contribute more, Albertans contribute more to the tax system than they receive back. They are a have that is contributing more than they receive. All right. Oh, I wanted all of them. Clearly not possible. So, is that the equalization? National average, the equalization line. Okay, so let's see here. I'll pull this up. Above average, you can see that this is fiscal capacity. Alberta is well above the average line. British Columbia also above the average line. You have places like Quebec and Prince Edward Island that are below the average line. And so these are the places that get equalization. In 2025, which provinces received equalization and how much did they receive? Can you give me the output in a chart? I like it's charting. So far, I'm actually pro equalization. I think it should be done a little differently. I don't like that natural resources are counted at all, but I don't like that because it disincentivizes development. And I think if you could put conditions on the money, so that like so much of it needs to be spent towards economic development projects, I think you could resolve that without changing how it currently works. Like I think there's multiple ways you could make equalization a better system, but the current iteration of it does seem to incentivize not developing your own province if you receive equalization payments. And I don't like how that is set up. Okay, for 2025-2026, the program is roughly 26.2 billion. That is a huge amount of money. With 7 recipients. Oh, okay. So the chart I wanted, it's gonna match these numbers. Let's have a look. Quebec. I mean, what's going on, Quebec? How come we need to give you so much money? What's happening there? Like Prince Edward Island, I mean that's really, really small actually, so that's bad. But like Ontario is huge population. They received 546 million. That's nothing. That's nothing. Okay, so all these are actually bad. Quebec looks like this because Quebec has a much higher population than these other ones. So these are the have-not provinces. Ontario, from my understanding, usually actually ends up as a net have. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, Quebec. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Quebec, Manitoba. I mean, a lot of them on the East Coast there. Is there something? Prince Edward Island. Wasn't that also on there? Newfoundland and Labrador, Prince Edward Island. Literally, Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island. This section, Newfoundland and Labrador. This section of Canada. What is going on? Why is this, like, why is the fiscal capacity of this section of Canada so much lower than the rest of Canada? Manitoba's a very small province. Like you zoom in, they've got one real city. But Saskatchewan is also that way, and they're a have. They're not a have-not. Like these ones are contributing more in fiscal capacity than the East Coast. Is there a reason why the East Coast of Canada seems to have lower fiscal capacity than the rest of the country? Let's see what it comes up with there. So I'm not going to go into each of these. As you'd expect, Quebec is still the one receiving the most. But we have a nice chart up here that shows it, so much better. The live controversy. A few things worth knowing. Since you follow Canadian politics closely, Newfoundland and Labrador Constitutional Challenge. Newfoundland and Labrador launched a constitutional challenge arguing the program disadvantages it and ignores the cost of delivering services. So they want more money. Its specific grievance is the cap. The formula counts 100% of natural resource revenue when applying the fiscal capacity cap without accounting for the cost the province incurs developing those resources. I dislike counting natural resources at all. I don't think we should do that. It would change the equation, but it would change the equation for every province. And so every province would still be equal. And you would develop your natural resources because they don't apply to the cap. Newfoundland and Labrador receives equalization for the first time since 2008. Oh, so they haven't received a whole lot of it. Most experts think the suit is unlikely to succeed because the Constitution only commits Ottawa to the principle of equalization. It doesn't dictate the formula or distribution. If it doesn't, then remove the frickin' resources. I mean, that is what would appease Alberta, and it would promote resource development by provinces. If you don't do that, then equalization should have conditions to force people, to force provinces into resource development. Western Critique, Premier Danielle Smith and Scott Moe have both called for an overhaul, with Smith arguing Alberta should receive the same per capita federal transfers as other large provinces, and Moe having tabled a 2018 proposal for a roughly 50% cut redistributed equally per capita. The deeper structural argument they and others make is the welfare trap critique. Oh, so this is basically what I've been talking about. The formula's automatic GDP linked increase and the way payments shrink as a province's own economy grows creates a disincentive for recipient provinces to develop resources or pursue pro-growth policy. I think this is one of the biggest problems in Canada. You've taken basically the East Coast, and you created a welfare trap for them where they don't develop their own resources and don't increase their own fiscal capacity, because doing so means they would receive less money. And there's a lot of ways you can fix it, but the consequence is having low GDP growth. If you don't fix it, they don't develop. You don't get productivity. You don't get productivity. You have a lot of problems. You gotta either put conditions on the money or remove the resources. I mean, I'd say putting conditions on the money is probably a better solution, because fiscal capacity also is like just your active tax revenue you can collect, and you want people to develop that as well, right? You don't just want them to develop resources, you want them to develop businesses and tax bases, and so you don't, honestly, like, I don't know, I think conditions and making it so that equalization is debated every year, and so the number changes, and depending on the need, equalization payments can change. It just makes more sense. Why don't we talk about it every year? Figure out the proper number. Defenders respond that there's little empirical evidence recipient provinces deliberately suppress growth to keep payments. Yeah, but like, you could incentivize them to take the money you give them and use it to develop their province. That could be something you incentivize rather than disincentivize. Like, humans work off incentive structures. Create better incentive structures for them. Like, that's the job of government. That's the partial inclusion resources rule already softens the disincentive, and that the program does what the Constitution asks, narrowing fiscal gaps so a child in PEI isn't stuck with worse public services than one in Calgary purely by accident of geography. I agree with that part. Like, I generally agree with equalization. I would like conditions on the money. And that is what I think. Conditions for economic development. Because if they keep being recipients, like, also the amount, there should be some clause in as like haves and have not, if they get closer, which they should be, if these provinces are receiving, the have nots are receiving extra money for development, both should get closer to the average eventually. There'll always be a resource gap. Like Alberta will always be a have with their oil until, oil is not necessary anymore. But I don't know what that future would even look like. But haves will get lower, closer to the average. Have-nots will get closer to the average, and you'd likely see growth, like significant growth in the have-not provinces, and that's what you want to trigger. And then as they get closer, you want to shrink the equalization, because like that the end goal is that everyone is able to provide for themselves, right? Like that's the end goal. And so as they get closer, you shrink equalization. There'll probably always be some degree of it. But I think we could significantly lower it by forcing the have-nots to develop more. That's my opinion. Renewal timing. The legislation is viewed periodically. The next renewal must happen before March 31st, 2029. So the formula you see now is the one in force until then, unless Ottawa reopens it. Oh, so there's a renewal coming up. Well, I mean, in 3 years. Maybe we can get change to it then. Like I largely agree with equalization. I don't agree with how they're currently doing it. What else was I asking down here? So these are the recipients and how much they received last year. So New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Manitoba, like these are all much smaller populations than Quebec, which is why the Quebec number is so large. Can I get the equalization payments for the year 2025 to 2026 per capita? Can you give it to me in a chart? Let's see per capita who's doing the worst. Okay, what was I asking here? Is there a reason why the east coast of Canada seems to have lower fiscal capacity than the rest of the country? Yes, and it's mostly structural and historic rather than anything about how hard people work or current policy choices. Fiscal capacity measures the revenue a province could raise per person across income, businesses, consumption, property, and tax rates. So a province scores low when incomes, business activity, property values, and resource wealth are all on the thinner side. Makes sense. Atlantic Canada lands below average on most of those at once, for a few reinforcing reasons. The deepest one is economic history. The Maritimes weren't always the poorer end of the country. In the age of sail and timber in the 1800s, Halifax and St. John were major ports with shipping and trade economies. Interesting. So the Northwest Passage, it's going to become open at some point. We don't know how far off, but it's likely to bring quite a development in shipping and trade to Canada. Ooh, oh my goodness, what happens? What happens? I gotta get rid of this, that's right. I don't like that. Northwest Passage. Let's see. So this will become the fastest way. Can I open it up? Of course, it's going to be difficult. So this is going to become the fastest way to get from Europe to China. And there is a huge amount of trade that passes from Europe to China. It goes like around the Cape or through the Panama Canal. But this will become a much faster way of doing it. And it's going to bring, when you have a trade route like this going through your territory, it allows you to access that trade route much easier. And so if you build an economy on trade, then it's a lot easier if you're right by a trade route. It just is. And so we could see a development in the what do they call them, the Atlantic provinces, like in the East Coast, because like that's historically shipbuilding and trade economies. And if we create a new trade route that cuts right above them, I mean, hopefully that brings them from a have-not to a have again. But that's another reason why equalization should be looked at. The shift to an industrial economy built on coal, steel, rail, and manufacturing pulled economic gravity towards central Canada, and Confederation-era policies like the national policy, tariffs, and freight rate structures reinforced that concentration in Ontario and Quebec. The region never fully recovered its relative position, and that's the long backstory to the maritime right grievance you're still hearing echoes about. Okay. The resource space is the second piece. The West has oil, gas, and potash that generates enormous revenues per person. Atlantic Canada's historic resource was the fishery, and the 1992 Northern Cod Memorial wiped out tens of thousands of jobs almost overnight, hitting Newfoundland and rural Nova Scotia especially hard. Forestry, agriculture, and tourism exist, but don't throw off resource royalty the ways Alberta oil does. Demographics compounded. For decades, the region exports its young workers going down the road to Alberta or Ontario for jobs, which left older populations behind. An older, more rural, more dispersed population means fewer peak earners, a smaller income tax base, lower property values, and harder economics of scale for everything. Smaller, less diversified economies also have fewer corporate headquarters and more seasonal and public sector employment, which drag down the business and income tax categories. Two important caveats though. Newfoundland is the genuine exception. Offshore oil made its actual fiscal capacity quite high since the late 1990s. The reason it gets little equalization isn't low capacity, it's the fiscal capacity. The reason it gets little equalization isn't low capacity, it's the fiscal capacity cap interacting with how resource revenue is counted, which we touched on earlier. So the East Coast has low fiscal capacity, really describes PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland's non-oil base, not Newfoundland's resource wealth. The second caveat is that equalization measures nominal capacity and doesn't adjust for cost of living. Atlantic price levels are lower than in Toronto or Vancouver, so the gap in actual living standards is somewhat narrower than the fiscal capacity numbers alone suggest. It's not frozen. Recent years have brought immigration-driven population growth. Growing Halifax and remote work draws people east. I think remote work's going to be a big one. Drawing people east. So the long out migration story has softened. If it helped, okay. Now let's give me these numbers. See, as soon as you do it per capita, Quebec actually goes way down. And these are the ones that we were talking about. Basically all the ones it listed here. PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, without Newfoundland's oil base. PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. Manitoba. No idea. No idea about that one. Looking at these three. So a lot of people. Let's see. Older, more rural. Right here. This is why demographic compounds it. For decades, the region exported its young workers, going down the road to Alberta or Ontario for jobs, probably other places too, which left an older population behind. An older, more rural, more dispersed population means fewer peak earners, a smaller income tax base, lower property values, and harder economies of scale for everything. Okay. Well, it looks like they're in a rough spot, these provinces. Hopefully, if we get the Northwest Northwest Passage in the next couple of years. When could the Northwest Passage open for shipping? Hopefully when this happens, we would see a revitalization of Eastern Canada. They largely had shipbuilding and trade as their big economic growers. And if we're right by the largest trade route, probably one of the largest trade routes in the world, that could drastically change the economics for these provinces. I mean, where's Canada? Where's the map? Like, we're looking all in here, and the passage would have ships coming in, and they go up. They go up and through, up and down. Why can't they pass through there? I'm guessing that one's not big enough for a large oil tanker to come through here. I mean, how much? That island, Ormond Island, blocking that strait. Can we nuke it? Nuke the island? Let's do some nuclear. What is it called? Geoengineering. Like what the Soviets wanted to do, to open up passages for ships. Probably not. Which means they gotta go up here. That looks suspiciously like a great passage right there. Bring them up, bring them down, and you're good. And they can get into Japan, China, Philippines. Because right now, they either go through Panama or they gotta go all the way down the Cape, right? It's hard to say because this is not properly scaled, right? You look at the top, and everything up here is much smaller than it looks like on a map. All this territory is so much smaller, and so this. Can I get a map to scale? Map to scale. As soon as you scale it, look at how tiny that gets up there. When you try and put everything to scale, like Greenland and Canada, they're side by side. As soon as you scale it, look at the gap. But yeah, it's much smaller than what a standard map makes it look like, because you're so close to the North Pole, and the globe is a circle, and to put on a map, they stretch it out into a square. And so that territory is actually a lot smaller than you'd think. But this is all actually closer to the equator than we. Does this oh, so that you guys put over Africa. Africa's closer to the equator. China, India. India's right there, basically to scale. Okay. I'm getting off topic. When could the Northwest? The short answer is, in a limited sense, it's already open and fully open for regular commercial shipping. It's probably still decades away, and fully open for regular commercial shipping is probably still decades away and more complicated than the sea ice alone suggests. The Northwest Passage is already seasonally navigable for part of the year. The number of voyages across the Canadian Arctic has quadrupled since 1990, and as sea ice has declined. At the end of 2024 melt season, the northern route of the passage was near ice-free, and the most recent record low year has seen all its channels briefly clear. So vessels do transit it today during a summer window. Mostly ice-strengthened ships, cruise tourism, and resupply traffic with caution. The biggest threshold breaks down roughly like this. Now, seasonal transit around 2050, ice-free September, a reliable summer route. Okay, so this is still a long way away. 2026 towards your year-round route. Ice-class ships. They carry, I mean, everything carries real uncertainty. Technology is advancing in such a way that I think you might be able to get through it even quicker than the numbers they're given, with development in technology and shipbuilding. I mean, icebreakers get better every year, right? But here's the catch specific to the Northwest Passage and why it lags the Russian route. Even as overall ice declines, the Canadian Arctic archipelago acts as a trap for thick, hard, multi-year ice that drifts down from the Arctic Ocean. I got a solution to that. Blow it up. Let's use the space lasers. We can burn that out, I think. That ice creates choke points, narrow channels that stay blocked and shorten the navigable season, even in otherwise low ice years. I mean, space lasers will fix that.